Imagine a city. Not some myth, not a legend, but a real place that predates even the Great Pyramids of Giza. Picture this: a sprawling metropolis in the Americas, alive and buzzing when most of the world was just figuring out city life. Now, imagine it all just gone. Not wiped out by war, not slowly fading away. Its people simply walked away, leaving behind their incredible monuments, their homes, their entire way of life, as if an unseen hand just erased them. This isn't fiction. This is the mystery of Caral, the oldest city in the Americas. For 1,000 years it thrived, a beacon of civilization. And then, silence. What on earth could make thousands of people abandon everything they'd built? The answer, as we're starting to piece it together, is as unsettling as the mystery itself. A story buried in the shifting sands and the very bones of the land. Hidden in Peru's arid Supe Valley, a couple of hours north of modern Lima, are the weathered remains of a civilization that completely rewrites the history books on early American cities. This is Caral, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. For a long time, most of the world had no idea how important it was, until archaeologists like Ruth Shady started digging in the 1990s and uncovering its true age and significance. And the dates were stunning. Radiocarbon dating showed Caral was booming as early as 3000 BCE. Some finds even suggest it's older than that. Think about it. Caral was a contemporary of ancient Egypt when they were building their first pyramids, and of the Sumerian city-states in Mesopotamia. This civilization rose and fell thousands of years before the Incas, the culture we usually associate with ancient Peru, even appeared. For about 1,000 years, from roughly 3000 to 1800 BCE, Caral was the bustling center of a wide-ranging society. It was the capital of a network of some 18 to 20 other towns spread across the Supe Valley and even beyond. These people built massive pyramids, striking sunken circular plazas, complex homes, and clever irrigation systems that turned the desert valley green. They were astronomers, engineers, farmers, and artists. But then, around 1800 BCE, after a millennium of growth and stability, Caral and all its related sites were systematically left behind. There are no signs of invasion, no evidence of major internal wars, not even a hint of a devastating plague. The people of Caral just left. Why they vanished is one of the biggest archaeological puzzles in the Americas. And the leading theory? A massive, disastrous shift in the very environment that had allowed them to flourish. To really get a sense of how big a deal Caral's disappearance was, we first need to imagine it in its heyday. Picture a city meticulously planned out, covering over 150 acres. Maybe 3,000 people lived in the city itself, but the wider valley civilization could have supported up to 20,000. This wasn't some primitive village. This was a highly organized urban center, the heart of what's known as the Norte Chico civilization, the first in the Americas. The buildings they left behind are simply incredible. 6 or 7 massive pyramids dominate the landscape. The biggest, the Pyramid Mayor, or Great Pyramid, shoots up nearly 60 feet and covers an area almost the size of 4 football fields. These weren't just piles of dirt and rock. They were complex, stepped structures with grand central staircases, often aligned with stars or planets, showing a pretty sophisticated grasp of astronomy. Many pyramids had ritual hearths where offerings were burned, maybe to their gods, or as part of intricate ceremonies tied to the calendar. Recent discoveries, like a new altar of fire at the nearby site of Era de Pando, keep reminding us how central these ceremonies were. These weren't tombs like in Egypt, but public spaces, centers of religion and power, and places where the community came together. Next to these pyramids were sunken circular plazas, a really distinctive feature of Caral's architecture that later Andean cultures would copy for centuries. These plazas, some of them quite large, were likely used for public gatherings, religious ceremonies, and watching the stars. Imagine it. The community gathered, the air filled with music. Archaeologists have found loads of flutes and cornets made from condor, llama, and deer bones. Especially around an amphitheater-like area, it paints a picture of a rich musical tradition. Life in Caral was made possible by a smart understanding of farming and how to manage resources. Even though the Supi Valley is dry, the Caral people built extensive irrigation canals. They drew water from the Supi River and from local springs to grow crops like squash, beans, sweet potatoes, and, very importantly, cotton. Cotton was huge for them, not just for clothes, but also for making fishing nets. And this brings us to another key part of Caral's economy, its connection to the coast, about 15 miles away. Archaeologists have found tons of seafood remains at Caral, fish bones, shellfish, showing a strong trade network between the inland farming towns and coastal fishing villages like Aspero. It was a cooperative system, cotton and gourds from the valley for fish and shells from the sea. This trade formed the backbone of their entire civilization. They even found goods from much further away, like annatto seeds used for pigment, which came all the way from the Amazon jungle, hundreds of miles distant. That tells you something about how far their trade networks reached. Maybe one of the most amazing things about Caral society is that there's absolutely no evidence of warfare. No defensive walls, no battlements, no hidden stashes of weapons, and the human remains found from its glory days don't show signs of violent injuries. This is pretty different from many other ancient civilizations around the world, whose histories are often filled with conflict. Caral seems to have been a peaceful society. What held them together wasn't military might, but shared beliefs, religious practices, and mutual economic benefit. They did have a social hierarchy, with priests or an elite class probably overseeing the farming, trade, and ceremonies. The discovery of a high-status woman's tomb at Aspero, nearly 5,000 years old, even suggests women could hold important positions in this society. They even developed a system of record-keeping using quepus, knotted strings, a practice the Incas would famously use much later. For 1,000 years, this complex system worked. Caral and its neighboring settlements grew, prospered, and innovated. They laid a cultural foundation that would influence Andean civilizations for millennia. They built a society that seemed to be in harmony with its surroundings. They were masters of their world, a testament to human cleverness and cooperation. And then, the earth itself began to whisper of change, of a coming disaster that no amount of ceremony or social unity could stop. The jewel of the Supi Valley was about to face nature's ultimate test. The shift from a bustling city to a ghost town wasn't instantaneous, but in archaeological time, the abandonment of Caral and its nearby sites around 1800 BCE seems pretty abrupt and total. Try to picture it, the busy plazas slowly falling silent, the rhythm of work in the irrigated fields faltering, the ceremonial fires on the pyramids no longer lit. One by one, families and then whole communities started packing up. They turned their backs on the massive structures their ancestors had built and walked away from the only homes they'd ever known. What archaeologists find is stark. Layers of human occupation just stop. The carefully maintained canals begin to fill with silt, no longer cared for by expert hands. Houses fall into ruin, not from violence but from sheer neglect. There are no widespread signs of a final, desperate battle. No evidence of a population wiped out by disease. No hint of a conquering army. Instead, it looks like an orderly departure, a deliberate giving up of a way of life that had lasted for 1,000 years. And it wasn't just Caral. Across the Sup Valley, and even in the neighboring Pativilca and Fortaleza valleys, the same pattern emerges. Some 18 to 20 urban centers that formed the backbone of this Norte Chico civilization met a similar fate around the same time. This coordinated desertion points to a massive crisis, a regional event so devastating that it made an entire area, once a cradle of civilization, unlivable for its people. What makes this abandonment especially eerie is the lack of written records. The people of Caral, for all their sophistication, didn't develop writing like their contemporaries in Mesopotamia or Egypt. Their history, their beliefs, their reasons for leaving aren't carved on stone tablets or written on papyrus. They're only whispered through the silent testimony of the ruins themselves, through careful study of soil layers, ancient pollen, and the very layout of their abandoned cities. This silence, this absence of a direct voice from the past, just deepens the mystery. and fuels the detective work to understand why they left. The abandonment wasn't necessarily a single panicked exodus. It was likely a gradual process, maybe unfolding over several decades. As things got worse, communities on the edges or those most vulnerable might have been the first to go. Their departure would have put even more strain on the settlements that remained. Perhaps there were attempts to adapt, to find new solutions, to appease whatever forces, natural or supernatural, they believed were causing their suffering. Friezes found at Vishama, a coastal site linked to Caral but from a later period, show emaciated figures with empty stomachs next to a toad, an Andean symbol of water and fertility. Was this a desperate plea for relief from drought? The sheer scale of it is hard to fathom. It wasn't just a city, it was an entire civilization, a whole way of being that was ending in this region. For generations, the Supi Valley had been their world, their source of life, the sacred land where their ancestors were honored. To leave all that behind suggests a pressure so immense, a future so bleak, that moving on became the only option. The silence that fell over Caral around 1800 BCE would last for thousands of years. The Great Pyramids, once vibrant centers of life, slowly eroded under the desert sun and winds. Their true significance was forgotten, and people eventually mistook them for natural hills until modern archaeology began to peel back the layers of time. But the question always lingered, hanging heavy in the dry desert air. What happened here? What could possibly drive an entire civilization away from its heartland? Early theories were all over the map, but one by one, many of them started to crumble as more evidence, or lack of it, came to light. When a civilization as advanced and long-lasting as Caral just up and vanishes, of course, we look for reasons. In the early days of research, and even today in popular imagination, several ideas were floated for its decline and abandonment. But as archaeologists dug deeper and the evidence piled up, many of these first theories either got tossed out or just didn't have enough solid proof, pushing researchers to look for more complex and maybe more unsettling culprits. One of the first things people often think of with collapsing civilizations is war or violent conquest. History is full of cities sacked, cultures crushed, and people driven out by invaders or internal fighting. Could Caral have been taken over by a rival power, or did its society just fall apart from within due to violence? Well, the archaeology of Caral is pretty quiet on that front. As we mentioned, one of the really unique things about the Caral civilization during its 1,000-year peak is the almost total lack of evidence for warfare. Digs haven't turned up defensive walls or fortresses. There are no big stashes of weapons, no spears, no shields, no signs of a military. Plus, skeletons from that time don't show the kinds of injuries you'd expect from battles. This peaceful nature really sets Caral apart and makes a big war an unlikely main reason for everyone leaving. Sure, there might have been small skirmishes or social tensions. What society doesn't have those? But there's just no archaeological footprint of a conflict big enough to cause an entire regional civilization to pack up and go. Okay, so if not war from outside, what about an implosion from within? Sometimes societies crumble because of internal problems. Maybe people lost faith in their leaders, or there was a catastrophic social breakdown, or unsustainable divisions between classes led to rebellion. Social layers definitely existed in Caral, with a clear priestly and administrative class. But there's no direct evidence pointing to some fatal internal crisis that made everyone abandon the entire region. The way they left, seemingly in an orderly fashion, without signs of widespread destruction or chaotic overthrow, doesn't really fit with a society tearing itself apart. Plus, the fact that so many sites across the Supi Valley and beyond were abandoned around the same time suggests a cause that was bigger than the internal politics of just one city. What about disease? A devastating plague can certainly bring a thriving society to its knees. But like warfare, solid proof for a civilization-ending epidemic is missing from Caral's archaeological and skeletal record. Ancient people were definitely vulnerable to sickness, but there's no specific sign that an epidemic was the main reason for the mass exodus from the Supi Valley. An event like that might leave traces in how people were buried or specific marks on bones, but those haven't been found as a widespread, defining feature of Caral's last years. Economic collapse is another angle often explored. Maybe those complex trade networks that kept Caral going just fell apart. The flow of cotton to the coast for seafood was vital. If these trade relationships broke down, maybe because new trading centers popped up elsewhere, or resources in one part of the chain ran out, it could have seriously hurt Caral's economy. While shifts in trade and economic pressures are possible contributing factors, especially if resources got scarce, it's hard to see this as the only reason for such a complete and widespread abandonment without some other overwhelming pressure. Economies are often pretty resilient and can adapt, unless the very ability to produce things for trade is fundamentally destroyed. And this leads us closer to the theories that are looking more and more likely. Could they have just used up all their resources? Did 1,000 years of intensive farming wear out the soil? Did the population grow too big for the Supi Valley to support, leading to a shortage of wood, water, or fertile land? This is a plausible contributing factor. Any society that leans heavily on its local environment risks running out of things if its practices aren't sustainable in the super long run. Worn-out soil or deforestation could have made life harder and harder. However, the people of Caral had managed their environment successfully for a millennium. For a system like that to suddenly fail so catastrophically across an entire region, it usually takes a major external shock to throw things off balance. So, while these things, internal tensions, local fights, economic shifts, or slowly dwindling resources, might have played smaller roles, making society more vulnerable, they don't, on their own, seem to explain the sheer scale and timing of Caral's vanishing. The evidence, or rather the lack of it for these usual suspects, forces investigators to look for a more widespread, more powerful agent of change. The whispers in the dust, the subtle clues in the earth itself, started pointing towards a much more formidable enemy, the very forces of nature that Caral had for so long managed to harness. The focus of the investigation was shifting towards a developing environmental drama. As other explanations for Caral's abandonment started to look shaky, investigators began to zero in on the environment itself. The Supi Valley, an oasis in a dry landscape, was Caral's lifeline. But what if that lifeline started to fray, or worse, turned against its people? The theory that's gained the most ground, backed by a growing heap of archaeological and geological evidence, is that Caral's end was primarily driven by catastrophic environmental change. This wasn't just one bad event, but likely a perfect storm of devastating climate shifts and geological disasters that over decades made the region unlivable for such a large, settled population. The Caral civilization was built on a delicate dance with its environment. Their farming skills depended on a complex irrigation system that channeled water from the Sup River. This made them incredibly vulnerable to any big changes in that water supply. And it looks like major changes did happen. One of the main culprits seems to be long and severe drought. Studies of ancient climates in the Andes show periods of major climatic shifts. Ruth Shady, the lead archaeologist at Caral, has pointed to evidence suggesting that terrible droughts, possibly lasting for decades, hit the region right around the time Caral was abandoned. Some researchers even connect this to a bigger global climate event known as the 4.2 kilo-year event, a period of drying that affected civilizations worldwide, including in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. For a society that relied on river-fed irrigation, a dramatic and long-lasting drop in rainfall in the Andean highlands, where the Sup River starts, would have been disastrous. Canals would dry up, harvests would fail, and food security would vanish. Those disturbing carvings of starving people at Vichama offer some pretty chilling artistic support for this idea of famine. But drought might not have been their only enemy. The region is also seismically active. Peru sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, and powerful earthquakes are a known threat. Geological investigations have found evidence of a massive earthquake, estimated around 7.2 on the Richter scale, happening about 1820 BCE. An event like that would have caused incredible destruction to Caral's huge structures, its pyramids, plazas, and homes. Imagine the terror of the earth heaving, buildings collapsing, the very foundations of their world shaking. And beyond the immediate damage, earthquakes could trigger landslides, further wrecking infrastructure and farmland, and potentially changing river courses or blocking irrigation canals. Aftershocks, which often follow a big quake, would have just made things worse, both physically and mentally. The people of Caral actually built earthquake-resistant features into their buildings, like shikras, woven bags filled with stones placed in retaining walls to absorb seismic energy. But even these clever designs might have been no match for a truly enormous quake or a series of strong ones. Making things even worse were the notorious El Niño events. El Niño, when the surface waters in the eastern Pacific Ocean warm up, can have dramatic effects on Peru's climate. While it can bring torrential rain to the usually dry coast, these aren't gentle, life-giving showers. Instead, they often turn into devastating floods. Evidence suggests that Caral and the surrounding region got hammered by major El Niño-induced floods. These floods would have torn through the Supe Valley, destroying irrigation systems, washing away precious topsoil, and swamping fields. The sheer power of these floods could carry huge amounts of sediment and debris, completely changing the landscape. Some research shows these floods left behind slurries that formed coastal beach ridges, and C14 dating of stuff within these ridges helps pinpoint when these massive flood events happened. Such events could also raise the water table in the valley. Coupled with wind-blown sand, this could turn previously fertile farmland into useless swamps and marshes. So you've got this triple whammy of environmental disasters: long, harsh droughts drying out the land and rivers, powerful earthquakes smashing their city and tearing up the landscape, and catastrophic El Niño floods washing away their fields and infrastructure. It's really important to get that these weren't necessarily isolated incidents with long recovery times in between. They could have hit in devastating succession, or even at the same time, creating a relentless barrage of environmental stress. Archaeologists and geologists have found real evidence for these events. Sediment cores show layers of flood deposits. Fault lines and structural damage to buildings point to earthquakes. Changes in ancient pollen and animal remains can show shifts from wetter to drier conditions. The landscape itself tells a story. The Supe Valley, which once supported this thriving civilization, eventually changed, becoming increasingly sandy and dry, with dunes creeping into areas that used to be productive farmland. Dr. Ruth Shady herself notes that intense climate change transformed the productive valley of Supe into sandy lands with dunes. This environmental transformation wasn't just some background noise to Caral's decline. It was likely the main villain. The storm hadn't just gathered, it had broken with full force, and the people of Caral were directly in its path. The environmental nightmare faced by the people of Caral, the relentless droughts, the ground-shaking quakes, and the destructive El Niño floods, didn't happen in neat little boxes. Each disaster probably made the others worse, creating a cascade of crises, a domino effect that systematically knocked down the foundations of their thousand-year-old civilization. It was this deadly combination of environmental factors that likely pushed Caral past its breaking point, leading to the eventual, heartbreaking decision to leave their ancestral home. Think about the very core of Caral's existence: farming kept alive by complex irrigation. Long-term drought, as the climate data suggests, would have been the first major hit. As the Supe River's flow dwindled, their extensive network of canals would have started to dry up. Fields that once gave them plenty of cotton, squash, and beans would wither. Food shortages would become more and more common, leading to malnutrition and social unrest. Any stored food would quickly run out. The very basis of their economy and survival was under direct attack. Then, throw in the impact of a major earthquake. A quake of the magnitude suggested around 1820 BCE wouldn't just have destroyed their homes, temples, and public buildings on the spot. It could also have crippled their already stressed farming infrastructure. Irrigation canals, the lifeblood of their farms, could have been fractured, blocked by landslides, or had their slopes altered, making them useless. Springs and other water source might have dried up or moved. Rebuilding after such a disaster would be an enormous job, especially for a population already weakened by drought and scarce food. And don't underestimate the psychological blow of seeing their sacred pyramids, symbols of cosmic order and their connection to the divine, damaged or destroyed. It could have shattered their faith in their rituals and their leaders. Layered on top of this, or perhaps alternating with the dry spells, were the catastrophic El Niño floods. These weren't gentle rains that might ease a drought. These were deluges, causing flash floods that sent torrents of water, mud, and debris ripping through the valley. Any efforts to repair irrigation systems after an earthquake or during a drought could be wiped out in an instant. Fertile topsoil, built up over centuries of careful farming, would be stripped away and washed out to sea. Fields would be buried under layers of sterile silt and gravel, or worse, turned into unusable swamps and marshes as floodwaters changed drainage patterns and raised groundwater levels. The vital trade link with coastal villages like Aspero, which supplied essential seafood, could also have been badly disrupted if these villages were similarly battered by floods or coastal changes. The combined effect of these repeated environmental shocks would have been devastating. Each event would have weakened the Caral people's ability to bounce back, making it harder to recover from the next disaster. Imagine the incredible labor needed to clear canals blocked by earthquake debris, only to see them wrecked again by a flood, or to find the river too low to feed them because of drought. Resource depletion, which might have been a slow, manageable problem under normal conditions, would have sped up dramatically. Trees needed for building, fuel, and repairs would become harder and harder to find. Farmland, the very foundation of their society, was literally disappearing, either drying up and turning into desert or being washed away and contaminated with salt. The intricate social and economic fabric of Caral society would also start to unravel. The authority of the priests and elites, whose job was likely tied to mediating with the gods and ensuring cosmic balance and good harvests, would have been seriously undermined. If their rituals and knowledge could no longer predict or prevent these disasters, or ensure the land provided, faith in their leadership would crumble. Trade networks, which depended on producing surplus crops like cotton, and the stability of both inland and coastal communities, would falter as production collapsed and settlements became unlivable. It's likely that the population, facing starvation, the loss of their homes, and an increasingly hostile and unpredictable environment, began to make the agonizing decision to leave. This probably wasn't a single coordinated exodus, but more like a gradual bleeding out of the region. Smaller, more vulnerable settlements might have been abandoned first. Their inhabitants might have moved to areas they hoped were safer or more stable, or perhaps tried to join larger centers that were still functioning, putting even more strain on already shrinking resources. Eventually, even the main centers, including Caral itself, would have become unsustainable. The Supi Valley, once able to support a complex civilization, had been irrevocably damaged by nature's relentless assault. The dominoes, set in motion by climate change and geological instability, had fallen one by one until the entire structure of Caral society in the Supi Valley collapsed. The story of Caral is a powerful reminder of how even the most sophisticated civilizations are ultimately at the mercy of their environment. If you find these investigations into lost worlds and the forces that shape them fascinating, why not subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell? We regularly explore these ancient mysteries, piecing together the past to understand not only how these societies thrived, but also why they vanished. Your support helps us keep bringing these incredible stories to light. Even though Caral itself was abandoned, its cultural influence didn't just disappear into the desert. The innovations and social structures developed in the Supi Valley over 1,000 years echoed through later Andean civilizations, leaving a lasting mark on ancient Peru. The decline of Caral as a major center around 1800 BCE was an end, yes, but in many ways it was also a new beginning, a scattering of knowledge and traditions that would contribute to the rich tapestry of later cultures, eventually including the mighty Inca Empire. Architectural styles that were signatures of Caral, like the stepped pyramids and those distinctive sunken circular plazas, became common features in later Andean ceremonial centers. The advanced understanding of irrigation and terraced farming, perfected in the tough environment of the Supi Valley, likely formed a crucial base of knowledge for future societies facing similar challenges. The idea of organizing society around ceremonial centers, the complex religious beliefs, and perhaps even parts of their understanding of the cosmos, were carried by migrating people and adapted by new cultures in new regions. The Quipu system of record-keeping, first seen at Caral, is perhaps one of the most direct and tangible legacies, famously picked up and elaborated on by the Incas thousands of years later. The extensive trade networks Caral established, linking the coast, the highlands, and even the Amazon, set a precedent for the kind of regional interaction and exchange that would define the Andean world for centuries. Even as its people scattered, Caral's influence lingered. Some groups may have moved to nearby valleys that were, at least for a while, less affected by the severe environmental changes. Sites like Vishama on the coast show elements of Caral culture but also adaptations to its later, harsher period, including those heartbreaking freezes of drought and famine. This suggests that the descendants of Caral, or people heavily influenced by its culture, were trying to survive and make sense of the dramatic changes to their world. However, despite the rich archaeological finds and the compelling evidence for environmental catastrophe, some questions about Caral's decline inevitably remain. This is mainly because its people left no written accounts of what they went through or why they made the decisions they did. While the combination of drought, earthquakes, and El Niño floods gives us a strong framework for understanding the pressures that led to abandonment, the precise human responses, the social dynamics of how they left, and what ultimately happened to all the scattered people are still open to more research and interpretation. Were there specific trigger events within that broader period of environmental decline that finally convinced the last inhabitants to leave Caral? How organized was the final abandonment? Did society completely break down, or were there organized migrations to new territories? While warfare isn't seen as the main cause, did the increasing scarcity of resources lead to local conflicts or rising tensions during the decline, even if it didn't result in a full-scale conquest? Research at Caral and its surrounding sites is ongoing. New discoveries, like new pyramids at nearby Chupachigaro or an elite woman's tomb at Aspero, are constantly adding more layers to our understanding of the broader Caral civilization and its reach. The lack of written records means archaeologists have to act like forensic investigators, meticulously piecing together a story from often subtle clues. The story of Caral's abandonment is therefore one that is constantly being refined, a historical cold case where new scientific techniques and continued digging can still bring significant breakthroughs. The very silence of Caral's inhabitants about their final days makes the quest to understand their fate all the more compelling, a poignant reminder of a lost world and the enduring power of the past to speak through what it left behind. The silent, windswept pyramids of Caral stand as a profound monument. They're not just a tribute to the ingenuity and resilience of America's oldest known civilization, but also a stark testament to the awesome and sometimes terrifying power of the natural world. For 1,000 years, the people of Caral skillfully navigated the challenges of their dry environment, building a society of remarkable complexity and, it seems, peace. Yet, in the end, they faced environmental changes so huge, crippling droughts, devastating earthquakes, and catastrophic floods, that even their sophisticated society couldn't withstand them. The story of Caral's abandonment isn't just some ancient historical footnote. It's a narrative that hits surprisingly close to home today. It highlights how critically dependent all human societies, past and present, are on a stable environment. The leading theory, that catastrophic environmental change led to Caral's demise, offers a sobering lesson about the vulnerability of civilizations, even those that last for centuries, to shifts in climate and geological forces. The people of Caral didn't choose to fail. They were overwhelmed by a convergence of natural disasters that systematically destroyed their ability to survive in the Supa Valley. Their peaceful nature, the lack of evidence for war causing their collapse, makes their story even more poignant. They weren't undone by human enemies, but by a changing planet. As our own modern world grapples with the escalating challenges of climate change, dwindling resources, and environmental damage, the fate of Caral serves as a distant but powerful warning. It reminds us that the complex systems we build, the technologies we develop, and the societies we cherish are all built on an ecological foundation that we have to understand and respect. The mystery of why Caral's people vanished may never be entirely solved. The nuances of their final decades are likely lost to an unrecorded past. But the stones of their city, the parched earth of the Supe Valley, and the ongoing work of archaeologists continue to speak. They tell a story of innovation, of community, of a deep connection to the cosmos, and ultimately, of a heartbreaking surrender to forces beyond their control. Caral is more than just a lost city. It's a timeless human story of ambition, achievement, and the enduring, often uneasy, dance between civilization and the environment. Its silent ruins challenge us to listen closely to the lessons whispered by the past, for they may hold vital keys to navigating our own future.